All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for coming. This is a presentation on the college personal statement and perfecting your narrative. I'm Dan Lee, and I'm here with Vitaly Borishan, and we are the co-founders and senior admissions consultants at Solomon Admissions Consulting. And so as we're going through this presentation, please feel free to send us any questions that you may have in real time, and we'll try to get to them either at the end of each section if it's a very brief question, or at the end of the presentation if it's a slightly lengthier question. All right, so Vitaly and I both graduated from Georgetown University Law School, and we have over a decade of admissions consulting experience getting applicants into top 20 schools. Our success rate is that over 90% of our students get into one of their top 3 choice colleges. So the first question to ask is why should you care? So just as a stat that I will throw out there, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Stanford reject over 60% of applicants who have both a perfect 4.0 GPA as well as a 2400 SAT. So those 4 schools every year, over 60% of the applicants who apply who have over a 4.0 and a perfect 2400 are just flat out rejected, not even waitlisted. Stanford, in fact, rejects 70% of the students with perfect SAT scores. So naturally, grades simply are not enough. Grades are necessary to be considered seriously, but they're not sufficient to get you in. Here are just 2 quotes for you. The first quote is from The Guardian. It's not just grades and test scores that colleges care about these days. It's extracurricular involvement, leadership, volunteer work, socioeconomic background, and race. Under this system, highly qualified applicants are routinely rejected and never given an explanation as to why, unquote. In the New York Times, admissions directors at these institutions say that most of the students they turn down are such strong candidates that many are indistinguishable from those who get in, unquote. This is a chart showing our 2014 acceptance rates of the students that we work with, as well as the students who applied to these universities this past year. The first column is the average acceptance rate at the national universities listed in 2005. So a decade ago, the average acceptance rate at Columbia was 12%. This past year, the average acceptance rate at Columbia in the second column is 6.9%. And in the third column, this past year, over 28% of the students we worked with were accepted at Columbia University. And you can see the averages down the line. For instance, at Cornell, about a decade ago, 31% of students got into Cornell. This past year, only 14% of students who applied to Cornell got in, and slightly over 40% of the students we worked with got into Cornell. So the next thing we're going to cover is how your personal statement impacts admissions decisions. Elite colleges have slightly varying standards for evaluating applicants, but by and large, they all have the same system, and that system is one where they give you 2 ratings. They give you an academic rating and a personal rating as well, and typically both of these ratings are anywhere from a 1 to 9 scale or a 1 to 5 scale, depending on the particular school that you're applying to. So the academic rating is half of your overall score, and it takes into account your class rank, your grades, and your course difficulty, as well as your SAT and SAT 2 scores, and in some cases your ACT score. And in case any of you are wondering, the ACT is taken just as seriously as the SAT by all institutions these days. So your personal score, which constitutes 50% of your overall rating, is something that you very much have control over and is improvable at the time that you apply. And so half of that personal score is based on the quality of your personal statement, your supplemental essays, every school you apply to, that's in the top 30 will have a extensive supplemental essay asking you, in some cases, why you want to go to that school, what you want to major in, and also another part of your personal statement that a lot of applicants leave out is the addendum. A lot of students we work with have had maybe one or two bad semesters where they got a B or two during that semester, and so in those cases, it's very, very smart to write an addendum explaining exactly why that happened. If you had outside commitments outside the classroom that were taking away from the amount of time you could commit to class, then it's very important to mention that. The other half of your personal rating consists of your activity sheet. Students applying to the top schools must submit a brag sheet that's separate from the Common App main application form, and a lot of students simply fail to do that, and they end up losing about 10 points on their application because of that. A lot of schools do interviews, and obviously the recommendation letters are incredibly important at the top schools because they really distinguish the students who are very good students from the great students. So going into the personal statement, the personal statement really is your one and only chance to stand out from the crowd of perfect GPAs and test scores. AdComs, or people who are in the admissions committee, will present your application to the admissions committee for a vote on your candidacy, largely based on their impression of you through the essays. First and foremost, it is a marketing tool, and it's a tool that answers the question, why must we let you in? Your personal rating is determined in large part by your essays. So the next natural question is, what does my essay need to accomplish? There's several different goals for your personal statement when you apply to college. The first is that the best personal statements are slice of life essays, and they are by far the most memorable. So when I say a slice of life essay, I'm not talking about an essay where a lot of applicants, they will simply give you a condensed biography of their entire life in their personal statement. That's not what admissions committees are looking for. They're looking for you to give them a very interesting and narrow view of one small aspect of your life, and hopefully that small aspect sheds light on kind of who you are overall as a person. The personal statement should really only apply to you and to no other applicant. And so your goal when you write a personal statement for these top schools is that you want to be the one-line applicant. And what do I mean by that? So a lot of applicants really, really blend into the crowd at the top schools. For instance, there are a lot of applicants who do very standardized community service activities and play one or two varsity sports. And so for the most part, those applicants simply are not going to stand out at an extremely competitive school because there are so many other applicants that look like them, whereas, for instance, an applicant who wants to major in classics and who plays a jazz saxophone is going to look very different, since almost nobody who applies fits that profile. And so by one-line applicant, I mean that you want to be the applicant where the admissions committee refers to you as, oh, can you pull the application of that kid who plays jazz saxophone and wants to study classics? And so that's kind of your goal for your personal statement. So the essay must emotionally engage the reader and take them on an emotional journey. And the essay must also showcase a unique point of view that no other student brings to the incoming class. That's very important. They're looking for students who bring a different viewpoint to the class. And lastly, the essay must reinforce your overall positioning strategy and the theme of your application. And so what do I mean by that? The best applications by far have a overarching theme and message that runs throughout the recommendation letters, your Common App main essay, and all of your supplemental essays, as well as any other parts of your application, like your activity sheet or your brag sheet. There has to be kind of one unifying theme that really makes you stand out. That's what they're looking for at the end of the day. And as we're going, please feel free to type in questions in the chat box on the right if you have questions as we're going along. So the next thing I'd like to cover is probably one of the most important things, which is strategic positioning and crafting one's narrative. Strategic positioning is simply positioning your strengths against an institution's weaknesses so that you stand out the most and you have the greatest chance of getting in. And so when students come to us and they work with us, I always tell them, listen, the most important thing we help you on is actually not your essays. It's figuring out who you're going to be in the incoming class that no one else can be. And that's really the most important thing, because at the end of the day, if you are someone in the incoming class that 500 other people could be, your chances of getting in are very low. So what is strategic positioning? Strategic positioning is a strategic plan for making your application stand out. So I mentioned before, it's positioning one's strengths against an institution's weaknesses. So I don't know if any of you watched tennis or caught Wimbledon a week ago, but the tennis analogy would be Rafael Nadal's lefty forehand going straight to Federer's weaker one-handed backhand. And so you're really pitting, if you're Nadal, you're pitting your strength, which is your left-handed forehand, against Federer's weaknesses, which is his one-handed backhand, which tends to break down under pressure. And so it's basically, strategic positioning is simply a way of making you stand out from the crowd. So an example of that would be, it would be more advantageous for a engineering whiz who wants to study engineering, who has a lot of science awards, to market his strong engineering background to Yale, where, at Yale, there simply are not as many high-level engineering majors applying as there are to MIT, and it would be less advantageous for that person to apply to MIT, where they would just be a dime a dozen. Okay, so next I want to address strategic positioning and building a class, and this is very important. Admissions committees are very consciously building a class. So what does that mean? First and foremost, top colleges are looking for a well-rounded incoming class, and that means that they are not looking for well-rounded students. So if you're a well-rounded student, it is very much of an uphill battle that you're facing to get into some of these top schools. So the key question to ask is, who are you going to be in the incoming class? And that is an incredibly important question, because who you are in the incoming class has to be someone who is very unique and that no one else can be. If 200 other applicants can be who you are in the class, you better be more qualified than those 200 other applicants. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult for them to slot you into the class. Another question they're asking is, what talent or perspective do you bring to the incoming class that no one else brings? So they really, especially in the essays, they're looking for people who have a different perspective, who would enrich the diversity of the incoming class. And one of the last things they're looking at is, do you have the potential to be a future leader in your chosen field, whether that's academics, politics, science, or business. They're really looking for people who are going to take the name brand of their institution and make it bigger and bigger. And so that's basically what building a class is. And before I go on to the next slide, I just want to point out one thing. A lot of the students I work with, they are well-rounded. And so one of the big challenges in working with them is that we have to make their application look not well-rounded. We have to make them look very specialized. And that's very important, because there is a term of art in the field. Adcoms call well-rounded kids who are very bright BWRKs, and that stands for bright, well-rounded kids. It's typically a student who has grades in the top 5% of the class, who scored in the 99th percentile on the SAT, who played 3 varsity sports, and is the president of 2 clubs. That student would be considered a bright, well-rounded student, and those students, for the most part, unless they write a phenomenal application, are rejected across the board at the Ivy League schools. So example number 1 of strategic positioning. We work with a lot of applicants who are recruited athletes, and so one thing I will say is that the biggest knock on recruited athletes from the viewpoint of admissions committees is that Adcoms view recruited athletes as only adding sporting prowess to the incoming class. And oftentimes, a lot of essays that athletes write talk about the winning shot in sports, and that's exactly what they're not looking for. They really want athletes who bring more to the incoming class than just being a phenomenal athlete. So the strategy to get around that is to center, if you are a recruited athlete, you really want to center your personal statement around what impact, both intellectually and in terms of extracurricular involvement, that you could bring to the incoming class outside of sports. That's very important. Second example is strategic positioning, which is very common. A lot of applicants that we work with come to us, they're junior or senior year of high school, and they've done a lot of activities, but they're well-rounded students. So they're well-rounded students, and they have great grades and great SAT scores, but this is a huge problem because, as I said before, the vast majority of students who are bright, well-rounded students are rejected at the Ivy League. And so the admissions committees at top schools typically don't like admitting well-rounded students into their incoming class because they really, like I said, they're building a class that is well-rounded, which means the students themselves are not necessarily well-rounded. The students tend to be specialists who are the best at one thing, and so they really want students who are focused on one or two areas. So the strategic positioning for getting around that, which we do with a lot of applicants, is to center the personal statement and every aspect of the application, including the rec letters, on really a singular passion or intellectual pursuit that makes the applicant seem more focused, and that's really the key. So I'm going to talk briefly about special considerations for Asian American and Indian applicants. About 50% of the students we work with are Asian American and Indian, and they faced an extremely heightened bar at the Ivy League and at other top 20 national universities. Not so much at the liberal arts colleges, but definitely at the national universities. There's a heightened bar for Asian American students and Indian students. A couple quotes from some major newspapers. The Boston Globe, quote, "Some call it the bamboo ceiling of racial quotas, telling stories of Asian American students with perfect SAT scores and GPAs turned down by elite colleges who limit the number of Asians they will admit, effectively forcing them to face a higher bar for admissions than other racial groups, including whites," unquote. The New York Times, quote, "Top colleges are clearly limiting the number of Asians they admit," unquote. The Los Angeles Times, quote, "Nowadays, nobody on an admissions committee would dare use the term racial quotas, but racial stereotyping is alive and well. And although colleges would never admit students based on quotas, they fearlessly will sculpt the class with race and gender percentages in mind," unquote. New York Times, quote, "This clearly shows that these colleges set a quota for Asian students," unquote. The cap on Asian students at the majority of Ivy League schools is about 20%. Sarah Harbison, the former Associate Dean of Admissions at UPenn, mentioned that, and yet even when Asian American students meet this high threshold, they may be destined for the waitlist or outright denial because they don't stand out among the other high-achieving students in their cohort. The most exceptional academic applicants may be seen as the least unique, and so admissions officers are rarely moved to fight for them," unquote. That's a very, very important quote because at the end of the day, the process is not 100% meritocratic in a lot of ways, and so there's a human element to it, and that's important to keep that in mind because if you don't emotionally move the reader and get them behind you, they're human. They may just, you may do everything else perfectly, but they will not go to bat for you, and that's important to keep in mind. And there have been a bunch of recent lawsuits and investigations. The U.S. Department of Education launched an investigation into allegations that Harvard and Princeton discriminated against Asian American applicants in 2011. The investigation is ongoing. And in May 2015, a coalition of 64 Asian American associations and civil rights groups filed a lawsuit against Harvard for what it sees as discriminatory admissions practices. So here are some hard stats. Back in 1997, there was a study done that looked at quite a few applications drawn from several different Ivy League schools, and it compared extracurricular activities and statistics across different types of groups, both racially and socioeconomically, to see exactly how the class is being sculpted. So in the study in 1997, and keep in mind in 1997 things were not nearly as bad as they are for a lot of Asian American students. Given similarly qualified applicants in terms of GPA and SAT scores, as well as extracurricular activities, in 1997 it was statistically shown that relative to equally qualified Asian and Indian American applicants at elite colleges, that, number one, similarly qualified white applicants were 3 times as likely to be admitted. Number two, similarly qualified legacy applicants were 6 times as likely to be admitted. So a legacy applicant is just simply someone who's either their mom or their dad went to that institution. Legacy applicants can be of any race, but they tend to be primarily white in most cases, just because in the last generation or so, there was much less diversity at the Ivy League schools. And number three, similarly qualified recruited athletes are 20 times as likely to be admitted. I always tell students I work with who play sports, listen, if you are good at athletics, that is the number one easiest way to get into a top Ivy League school. So going on, another stat, to be accepted to top private universities, Asian American students need on average an SAT score which is 140 points higher than white students, and this was a 2009 study. What that study doesn't point out is that Asian American students also need better extracurricular activities as well in order to get in. So that's what that, they mentioned the SAT score, but they don't mention the activities. Over the last 20 years, the percentage of Asian American students at Ivy League universities has remained the same at 17 to 20%. In comparison, the percentage of Asian Americans at UC Berkeley, where it became illegal to consider race in admissions, has skyrocketed to 45%. So while the number of Asian American applicants to Harvard has almost tripled in the past 2 decades, there are actually fewer Asian American students admitted to Harvard and to other universities in 2012 than in 1992. So this chart shows Asian American students age 18 to 21 and enrollment at elite colleges from the last 2 decades, from 1990 to 2011. And so the elite colleges they're looking at are Harvard, Yale, Caltech, Princeton, Brown, Columbia, Cornell, Dartmouth, and Penn. And so the vertical column shows the number of Asian American students age 18 to 21 who are applying to college, and it basically shows the percentage that are at the percentage of these different schools that are made up of Asian Americans. So basically, the number of Asian American applicants to these top schools has more than doubled in the past 2 decades, yet the number of admitted Asian students has stayed the same. The only exception being Caltech. And by the way, Caltech, their admission system, and MIT is very similar as well, completely different from the Ivies, and their system tends to be very meritocratic in that they typically just take the people with the greatest accomplishments and the highest numbers. So building a class, a lot of students we work with apply to engineering departments, and so quite a few of the top schools, for instance, Columbia, Cornell, Penn, Duke, Carnegie Mellon, they all have a completely separate admissions process for engineering. And so when that happens, you have to keep a couple things in mind. So first off, I just want to mention that Asian and Indian students, on average, 58% of U.S. Math Olympiad winners, 75% of the Computing Olympiad winners, and 64% of Intel Science Talent Search finalists. By the way, we sponsor the Intel competition every year, and it's overwhelming the number of Asian Indian students that do well at those competitions. Secondly, since enrollment percentages stay the same, it means that the Asian and Indian applicants are being evaluated not as individuals, and that's very key. You're not being evaluated as an individual, but you're being evaluated against thousands of other ultra high achieving Asian and Indian students. So when you're applying, the reason a lot of Asian Indian students that we work with tend to struggle when they work independently is because they're not aware that their application is actually being compared against these harsh stereotypes that are placed on Asian and Indian students, and so you're really not given a fair shake if you're not cognizant of the biases and the rules that are being used against you in the evaluation process. So another thing I'd like to mention is we do work a lot with students who are Asian and Indian males, and this is a very important distinction. Asian and Indian males are the most overrepresented in science, math, and engineering. and as a result, they have the toughest challenge and admissions when they're applying to an engineering department, because typically, I mean, I used to work as an engineer, and I can say the work environment tends to be pretty heavily dominated by Asian and Indian males, and so because of that, they want to limit that enrollment to get more diversity. And so the flip side of that is, if you are Asian Indian male and you apply to engineering, they hold you had better be in the top 25 to 30% of the incoming engineering class, not only in terms of numbers, but also in terms of extracurricular achievement. And one thing I will say is, it is definitely slightly easier to get in if you're Asian and Indian female and you're applying to engineering. On average, female applicants who apply to MIT are about 2.5 times to 3 times as likely to get in as an equally qualified male applicant. So common perceptions. I mentioned biases. Here are some common perceptions that elite colleges have of many Asian and Indian applicants, and I can tell you this is very true, because a lot of the Asian and Indian students I work with, we work with them to make sure that they don't fall into any of these traps. So the first trap is that Asian and Indian students are notorious for being pre-professionally oriented, often majoring in the same fields. And those fields tend to be, they either want to be a doctor, they want to be an engineer, or they want to be an investment banker. And so if you fit into one of those 3 categories and you mark your application as such, you're most likely not going to get in. Asian students tend to have a very homogeneous set of extracurricular interests, such as the stereotypically Asian extracurriculars like tennis, violin, and the math team. By the way, I'm Asian and I did all 3 of those in high school. Unfortunately, Harvard isn't going to want 400 Asian pre-meds and engineers who excel at math, piano, and tennis in its freshman class of 600 people. Harvard is building a class, and 400 Asian pre-meds or engineers are not on their list of goals. That's very important to keep in mind. So if you're thinking about if you're great at engineering, or you want to be a doctor and you're thinking about marketing your application as such, I would highly, for 99% of Asian applicants, I would not recommend that, unless you fall into the 1% where you're so exceptional to the point where it doesn't matter. Asians are viewed as quiet, diligent students who don't rock the boat. Unfortunately, this is not what elite colleges are looking for, and far too many essays and recommendation letters reinforce this stereotype. A lot of the Asian American applicants I work with, I read some of the recommendation letters, and they say, so-and-so is very hardworking, but they're quiet. That's the kiss of death. Your recommendation letter cannot say that if you want to get into an elite school, and we make sure to work with students to talk to their recommenders to tell them, listen, there are certain biases you're up against. You're being stereotyped in a very, very narrow way, and there's just certain things that a teacher can say about a white student that they cannot say about an Asian student, otherwise the Asian student won't get in. So I'll give you a case study. So one Asian male student we worked with, this student was originally applying, he was applying to engineering, and he came to us for help after he had worked on his own to apply to Columbia, early decision, and he was deferred by Columbia Engineering after applying early, and he was eventually rejected by Columbia working on his own. And so he came to us on December 15th when he got deferred by Columbia, and he panicked because the deadline was January 1st, so he had 2 weeks to get all of his other applications together, and he needed help. So this student had a perfect 4.0 unweighted GPA out of 4.0. He was ranked number one in his class at a competitive, highly ranked public school in the Northeast, and he took the most difficult AP course load. He had a 2340 out of 2400 on the SAT, and extracurricularly, you would think he was very strong. I mean, he was a Siemens semi-finalist. He was an Intel Science and Engineering finalist. He had published research in engineering. He was class president. He did varsity tennis. He was the first finalist in the All-State Orchestra, and he was an Eagle Scout, and he was the founder of the Ecology Club at his high school. So applying on his own, even with all that, he was rejected by Columbia. So I read his essays. His weaknesses were his essays, his packaging, and his presentation. So his essays talked about science, which you simply cannot do even if you are a high-achieving Asian Indian student. You can't talk about science in your essays unless it's something that's completely off the charts brilliant. And so, you know, being a senior semifinalist, I mean, that's impressive, but the problem is there are so many Asian students that are more impressive than that who are getting into these places over this guy. And so for that reason alone, you cannot talk about science in your essays. And so what we did was that this particular student also happened to have interest in environmental engineering. And so he founded the Ecology Club freshman year. And I told him, listen, the conservation ecology movement is predominantly white. Almost no Asians are participating in it. And so because of that, you're going to be the conservationist. You're going to be the Asian conservationist in the incoming class at Columbia. And so that's a much easier sell to Columbia because not that many Asian students who are great at conservation are in the applicant pool. So like he was that person. It's a very easy person to be, and it's very unique because no one else can be that. And so we wrote his essays about his interest in conservation, his work with the Ecology Club. And so because of that, he was accepted to Cornell Engineering, which is also very difficult to get into. And so, and that was primarily because we changed his positioning. Yes, we worked a tremendous amount on his essays, but the most important thing we did with his application is positioning, because instead of positioning himself as someone who's really into computer science and engineering, we positioned him as somebody who wanted to be a conservationist, and he still got to major in engineering. And now I'm going to talk about personal statement best practices. So the first point is that the personal statement is not your typical high school essay where the teacher is only concerned with your knowledge of the pertinent facts. That's very important to keep in mind. College admissions essays are often read by overworked and really tired admissions officers in an incredibly short time span and oftentimes at a late hour. And so if you can't catch their attention and impress them after they've read hundreds of other essays over the last few weeks, then you've really lost the battle. So how is that achieved? We'll go ahead and discuss this. This is a very important slide. So cliche essay topics to avoid. And these essay topics are, for instance, if you apply to Yale or Stanford, literally hundreds, if not thousands of students write about these exact topics. And for the most part, their applications are not taken very seriously. There's a reason I say that over 90% of essays submitted by perfect students to the top schools are just flat out bad, and they're bad because oftentimes it's as simple as it's the wrong topic. So these topics are absolutely off limits. So the first topic is, this is one of the worst, it's your typical outward bound trip abroad where you work with people abroad who are either impoverished or less fortunate than you, and you spend your essay talking about your experience and how that taught you about hardship, and conversely, how fortunate you are in your life. I mean, that's very cliche, and it's really an essay that is going to get you rejected. So the second essay topic to avoid at all costs is the death of a relative, with very few exceptions. I mean, there are maybe one or two students I've worked with in the last 10 years where I let them write about that, and they've executed it very well. But for the most part, you should not talk about the death of a relative, because in the majority of cases, the personal statement is supposed to be about you, and it's very difficult to write a personal statement where you talk about the death of a relative, but where you shed a lot of light on yourself. The third type of personal statement that you should absolutely avoid, which I touched on already, is the winning shot in sports, or any essay for that matter about sports. And sometimes you know, students come up to me and they tell me, listen, Dan, I'm not trying out for the football team, but I'm really good at football, and I'm also good at you know, I do a lot of work with political science. Isn't that an interesting combo? Can I write my essay about sports? And I always tell them no. I mean, it's absolutely out of the question. So the fourth topic you want to avoid is just a lot of essays, especially with immigrants. They talk about the immigrant experience story and overcoming language barriers, as well as fulfilling your parents' dreams. And that's really a buzz killer, because they read thousands of those essays every year, and so you know, they may be sympathetic to the first one, but once they get to number 500 or 600, they're really not that interested anymore. Another very common essay topic to avoid are essays, and a lot of students do this unfortunately, that literally summarize your resume or your main extracurricular activity in paragraph form. They have your activity sheet for a reason, and so every part of your application should add something new and shed new light on yourself. And so because of that, you really cannot. You should avoid writing your essay about your main extracurricular topic. And the last type of essay to avoid, and one of the common main essay prompts asks you to talk about this, is that you should avoid writing about a topic or issue close to your heart. Like some essays will ask you to, talk about an important issue and how it affects you. And so the problem with writing about an issue that's close to your heart is that a lot of times you'll say a lot about the issue, but it doesn't necessarily reveal a lot about who you are. So one example would be, there's a student I worked with who wrote an essay about how she supports LGBT rights. And I told her, I think that's fantastic, but the only problem with that is a lot of people support LGBT rights, and that really says nothing different about you, and it doesn't make you stand out, because I think a large percentage of people on the admissions committee would agree with you. Okay, so now we're going to get into the mechanics of the personal statement. So you really have to hook the reader. And what do I mean? What do I mean by a hook? The first sentence or two of your essay must absolutely be spellbinding. A successful hook demands the reader's attention, or else the reader will check out mentally. So, what forms can the hook take? Hooks can be engrossing anecdotes or stories. They can be shocking one-liners, within reason, of course. Or in some cases, they can be a counterintuitive statement. A counterintuitive statement would be, quote, "The only sound worth hearing is silence," unquote. So something that gets you thinking a little bit. So an example of a hook opening to a personal statement that's an anecdote would be, quote, "Trapped in a cage, a sleek silhouette darts past the corner of my eye. Momentary calm gives way to sheer terror as a row of serrated, 3-inch-long steak knives stare me in the face. With only steel bars and the icy sea separating me from this prehistoric beast, I freeze," unquote. That, by the way, is talking about an applicant who went diving with great white sharks. Another example of a hook would be, quote, and this is an example of one that is a shocking one-liner, "I will offer you $250,000 to fund your startup, but on one condition: you must drop out of school," unquote. So something that kind of catches your attention. The tone of your personal statement, unlike English papers that you write in high school, should be very, very informal. So this is not an English paper that you're writing for high school. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that the college admissions essay, since it's an important piece of writing, needs to be formal. That's absolutely wrong. College personal statements are no place for formal writing or like a research paper. It's not a research paper, and a lot of smart students I work with, they literally think it's like writing a research paper, and it's absolutely the exact opposite of that. The successful personal statement will have the author informally speaking to his reader and really telling him a story, and that's the other key. Write the personal statement in the first person. The reader is much more likely to be engaged if if he is made to feel that he is part of it. Similarly, it's best to have your essay written in the active voice. It makes the essay infinitely more interesting to read, while writing the essay in the passive voice has the unfortunate effect of making the essay seem remote and academic. Very important, because you have to entertain the reader. The reader is selfish. The reader is greedy. They don't know you. They've never met you. And so you have to entertain them and get them to like you and really get behind your story. Anecdotes. Going back to what I said about having to entertain the reader, a lot of writing your personal statement is counterintuitive. You're not writing a perfect A English paper. You're writing a story for the reader that, number one, it entertains them, it takes them on an emotional journey, and it gets them to really like you and get behind your application. So that's very different from getting an A on an English paper. All successful essays follow the basic form. The author needs to tell the reader a story. Nobody wants to read a dry regurgitation of one's achievements. So that's the part where I told you, don't summarize your resume in paragraph form. The admissions officers have seen that hundreds of times. What they want to read is an interesting story that they can really get into and that they're interested in. Give them a good story of yourself that you would want to read, and they will respond in the best way possible. You really have to entertain your reader. I cannot stress that enough. If your reader is not entertained, even if your essay is very well written, it's not a good essay. So along the lines of entertaining your reader, you have to make sure that when you write your essay, you show and you don't tell. So you have to immerse the reader. Don't just tell the reader about the experience you're describing, but really immerse the reader in the experience by telling an entertaining, descriptive story. Nobody wants to read a dry regurgitation of one's achievements. This is done through descriptive details and through metaphors and similes. You have to entertain your reader, and he or she will in turn reward you for it. So an example of show, don't tell would be, a bad form would be, quote, I picked up my favorite book, Catcher in the Rye, unquote. So the way to rewrite that so that you show instead of simply telling is, I picked up my worn copy of Catcher in the Rye, which to me was like that one pair of jeans you're never quite ready to throw away. So note that the first version sounds formal and boring, while the second adds emotion and flavor. It describes the book itself and also gives a comparison, which adds another dimension to the item. With the help of the second statement, we are now much more convinced that Catcher in the Rye is indeed the author's favorite book. The ending of your personal statement is, in many ways, as important, if not slightly more important, than the opening hook. So the ending ideally must address the opening. And so the way the analogy I like to use is that you should think of yourself as a film director. So the opening of the book is like the opening of a movie. It allows you to zoom into the action with your camera. And the ending of the essay should be kind of like the ending of a great movie, where the camera zooms out and completes the narrative by providing closure on the opening scene. So the best endings address the opening and they provide closure. And of course, like with any great movie, great personal statements leave the reader wanting more. And so that's your goal. Writing a personal statement is like I said, it's not an English paper. It is an artistic performance. And if the reader is not emotionally moved by the end of it, you're going to have a struggle getting in. Okay. So I am going to take you through a sample essay that really covers all of the key points that we just discussed. So this is the essay before our edits, and then I'll show you the essay after our edits. And this is taken from a Stanford supplemental essay. Stanford is a school that gives you 3 ratings, not 2 like the other schools. So Stanford gives you an intellectual vitality rating separately in addition to giving you a personal rating as well as an academic rating. And so when Stanford refers to intellectual vitality, they're really referring to, do you love learning for the sake of learning? And so they're really looking for students who do well in school and really pursue their passions intellectually outside of school, and they tend to not let in students who are simply perfect students who really don't care that much about learning. And so the essay prompt is, Stanford students possess an intellectual vitality. Reflect on an idea or experience that has been important to your intellectual development. So this is the first draft by the student, and I'm going to point out kind of some of the things that are wrong with it. While taking a course on music history, my teacher explained to me the fascinating relationship between history and music. That opening line does not catch the reader's attention. So even though this is a short essay for Stanford, the same rules apply. He started out by talking about the famous Russian composer Dmitri Shostakovich. We listened to Shostakovich's String Quartet No. 8, which opens with 3 crashing chords. So the problem with that line is that he didn't show instead of telling. He simply told what happened, and it's not very entertaining to the reader. The teacher explained to us that the 3 chords represented the KGB knocking 3 times on one's door in the middle of the night and conveyed the composer's anti-Stalinist political beliefs and sense of oppression. For me, the chords express humanity's fear of losing basic freedoms and human rights, something that no person on this planet should have to endure. So the problem with that line is that it's incredibly cliche, and it's just not believable coming from a 17-year-old student. As a result, I began reading the original books on Shostakovich, which revealed to me the heartache and turmoil of Russian history in the 1900s. This experience strengthened my resolve to become a scholar of Russian history. Oh, once again, that line is very cliche, and it's just not believable in the context of the rest of the essay. In addition, my interest in the intellectual aspects of music amplified my understanding of mathematics. I began associating the pitch of certain musical notes on the piano with mathematical key frequencies. So the problem with that line is that a lot of the readers are educated, but they're not really informed about certain esoteric topics like music or mathematics. And so a lot of times the reader may not understand what that means, so you have to explain it to them. When I played a scale on the piano, I would associate numbers with each note. Music also impacted my understanding of literature. While watching Apocalypse Now after reading Heart of Darkness, I became obsessed with Richard Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries. So once again, this student is telling instead of showing. I became aware of how Wagner's music was played as anti-Semitic propaganda in Nazi Germany during a class discussion. I hope to pursue my profound passion and interest in music and other academic subjects at Stanford. So the problem with that ending line is, although it somewhat addresses the opening, it's not very creative, and it definitely doesn't leave the reader wanting more. So here's the version of that same essay after our edits. And by the way, all of our editors are Ivy League graduates who graduated from Ivy League schools, and they are working as professional writers. So the quote, thump, thump, thump. The bows crash like tsunami waves against the strings of the cello and violin. And so that's a much more descriptive hook because it's anecdotal and it grabs the reader's attention. Knock, knock, knock. That's the KGB knocking thrice on your door. They want to ask a few questions. When my music teacher explained to me that Dmitri Shostakovich's string quartets conveyed the composer's anti-Stalinist political beliefs and sense of oppression, I was floored. How could a series of 3 dissonant chords convey the fear of being taken away in the middle of the night under a totalitarian regime? That's a much improved version of the previous statement because it asks a rhetorical question and it gets the reader thinking. Intrigued, I read books about Shostakovich and became versed in 20th century Russian history. It didn't stop there. What other stories could music reveal? What else was I missing out on? So once again, asking rhetorical questions, maintaining the reader's attention. Soon, my knowledge of each subject I tackled deepened through music. When studying the Fibonacci sequence in mathematics, I no longer saw simply a series of numbers. Instead, I saw the key frequencies of musical notes associated with each number in the Fibonacci series. So that is important to put that in there because now you're explaining to the reader who's an educated person but not necessarily extremely knowledgeable about classical music and mathematics, what exactly that means. Conversely, when playing an A major scale on the piano, I began seeing the Fibonacci sequence. When my English teacher screened Apocalypse Now after we read Heart of Darkness, I became fixated with Richard Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries from the helicopter scene. I learned how his music was employed as anti-Semitic propaganda in Nazi Germany and became proficient in how fascism spread throughout Europe. Music has become the score for me to interpret and to become passionate about other intellectual pursuits. So it's an ending that addresses the opening and it does leave the reader wanting more. So that's really what you're shooting for. So a lot of what we do with working with students is one-on-one counseling. So some of the details on kind of what we do when we work with students who come to us. Obviously, we work with students very closely on personal statements. Instead of having students write personal statements like a lot of places do, what we do is we send students a questionnaire that has a list of 35 to 40 questions, asking everything about their background, and we really get to know them and everything about their lives. And basically, based on that, we cherry pick whatever the most interesting parts of their background are and come up with a overall positioning strategy, which I already discussed. And based on that strategy, we base everything in the essay and all the recommendation letters reinforcing that strategy. All of our consultants and editors are Ivy League graduates, and many of them are professional writers. We also help out with supplemental essays. Every top school looks for very different things in the supplemental essays. Stanford really looks for students who are kind of more entrepreneurial and laid back than Harvard, Yale, Princeton. Columbia looks for very different things. Columbia looks for very different students than Brown. And so, if you don't know what every single school is looking for, you're not going to know how to address the type of student that they want in their class. And so luckily, we know what all the top schools look for, and we also have very extensive templates and outlines for writing all the supplemental essays for all the top schools. Insider information on college preferences. Any school you want to apply to, especially in the top 50, I mean, we can pretty much tell you the ins and outs of every different major there, and all the pros and cons of going there. And also, obviously, we can tell you a lot about kind of the institutional priorities at that particular school and what they're looking for, and if your application would be a good fit at that particular school. Shoring up weaknesses. So we work with students for anywhere from 8th and 9th grade up till when they are juniors and seniors applying to college. And so shoring up weaknesses is simply, a lot of students we work with are well-rounded. They come to us and they say, you know what, I'm interested in the 8-year BA/MD program at Brown, or I'm interested in going to Yale. And so based on that, we map out their extracurricular activities for them so that they can do things that really show incredible initiative outside the classroom and that are not cookie-cutter extracurricular activities, so that they can also pursue their interest in being interesting people. We also help out with recommendation letters. Along the lines of personal statements, I would say over 90% of recommendation letters, even for top students, are not well written, and and they're not well written in many cases because of the fact that a lot of teachers simply don't know how to write a great recommendation letter. And so a lot of recommendation letters end up being, even if it's well-intentioned, they end up being bland and not very helpful to the students' candidacy at particular schools. And that's particularly problematic at a school like Harvard, where Harvard gives you separate ratings for every single recommendation letter. And so the recommendation letters at Harvard carry an incredible amount of weight. And so if all three of your rec letters are not incredibly strong, you're going to have a hard time getting to Harvard. Extracurricular activity consulting. So that's going back to showing up weaknesses. Like I said, we work with students anywhere from 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th grade to figure out what their goals are and to completely, in many cases, doing a 180 to change the trajectory of their extracurricular activities such that they will have a shot at getting to some of these schools they want to go to. Mock interview coaching. We coach people for interviews, and that's very important in some cases, not important in other cases, depending on who you're interviewing with. And we also provide a lot of consultations on financial aid. Not all schools are need blind. I mean, there are a lot of top schools like Johns Hopkins and Washington University that are need aware, and so if you don't apply for financial aid, you have a much higher shot at getting in. And one thing I will say about the wait list, we also help you get off the wait list as well. And 9 out of 10 cases, the first people who get pulled off the wait list are people who can full pay, who don't need financial aid. So as a kind of added bonus for coming to our presentation, we're going to give you guys $500 off any standard package of 5 or more schools in the next 24 hours. And this is our contact information, phone number, and email address. The easiest way to reach me is by email. This is dan.lee, L-E-E, @solomonadmissions.com. And the easiest way to reach Vitaly is vitaly.borshot@solomonadmissions.com. And so now I'm going to go into answering some of the questions you have. Okay, so the first question I have is, do you recommend that we include how our passion or pursuit would fit into the college we are applying to? So I'm assuming by that you mean that, okay, do you recommend that we include how our passion or pursuit would fit into the college we are applying to? So one thing I'll point out is the Common App changed this year. It used to be in the past couple of years that you could only change your Common App main essay 2 times for a total of 3 versions. Now the rule this year is that there are unlimited number of changes. So what that means is you typically use the same Common Application main essay when you apply to all the schools. And so this year, you can actually change up your Common App main essay for every single school that you apply to, which would be a tremendous amount of work. I wouldn't recommend it, but it might be a good idea at certain schools that are your top choices. As far as including how your passion or pursuit would fit into the college that you're applying to, I would absolutely do that, because at the end of the day, they want to know what you bring to the class and what you would contribute to the class. And if you have a passion or pursuit that fits into something that, you know, that they're not necessarily excelling at the moment, that would be a definite positive. Feel free to type in questions in the chat box on the right if you have any more questions. So another question I had is, where should I apply early decision, and do you recommend applying early decision? For 99.9% of applicants, I would recommend applying early decision or single choice early action somewhere. And the reason I say that is your chances of getting in early decision to a school are anywhere from double to quadruple your chances for getting in regular decision. And so because of that, and that's for several reasons. Number one, early decision is binding. So for instance, if you apply early decision to Duke, it's binding, which means you have to withdraw all of your other applications if you get in. And so because of that, what you find is that the early decision pool at the school is not named Harvard. Harvard's the one exception where the early pool at Harvard is stronger than the regular pool. The early pool at Duke or Johns Hopkins is significantly weaker than the regular decision pool at Duke and Johns Hopkins. And so because of that, it's less competitive and you're much more likely to stand out. So you should absolutely apply early decision. And a lot of times students will tell me, you know, listen, Dan, what if I don't know what school I want to go to? And I tell them, at the end of the day, you're going to have to pick one school anyways. And so you might as well just pick it now. And at the same time, either double or triple your odds of getting in. Another question I had is, do colleges often admit based on their minimum SAT reasoning and SAT subject test scores? So there's really no minimum or cutoff. Numbers are necessary, but they're not sufficient to get in. And so there have been, you know, a lot of applicants I work with and that we work with come to us because they want to get into schools that they wouldn't normally get into. And so the answer is they do not necessarily have cutoffs. One example I'll give you is we work with quite a few students who are slightly below the 25th percentile, both in terms of GPA and SAT score at places like Cornell and Johns Hopkins. And I will tell you, we are able to get them in because the rest of their application is so strong. And so it's not disqualifying, but at the same time, you know, your numbers do have to be within range. They can't be completely out of range if that's what you're asking. So another question I have is that if I play golf but I'm not necessarily the best, is it even worth trying to get recruited at the Ivy League? That's a great question, because we actually work with quite a few recruited athletes at the Ivy League. And so the thing to keep in mind is recruiting at the Ivy League is very different from recruiting at Stanford and Duke. And the rationale for that is Stanford and Duke are allowed to use athletic scholarships to recruit students. And so because of that, you get a lot of really good athletes sometimes who are not necessarily the best students. At the Ivy League, it's a much different standard for recruiting. So the Ivy League schools are not allowed to use athletic scholarships to recruit students. And so the impact of that is, number one, they have a hard time getting the top athletes who want a full ride. And number two, the flip side of that is the Ivy League also has a very high academic index cutoff for athletes. So what that means is an athlete has to meet a minimum academic requirement, both in terms of GPA and SAT score, to be taken seriously. The academic index is it's typically on a 240-point scale, and the cutoff, even for recruited athletes, is very high. It's, at a Harvard, Yale, Princeton, it's about 210, and so you still have to do well. And so because of that, a lot of students that we work with who are good athletes, but not necessarily great athletes, oftentimes make it onto the Ivy League team for golf or tennis, and simply because they're great students who make the academic cutoff and they happen to be good enough athletically. Okay, so another question I had is there a big benefit to participate in science programs during the summer? The answer to that is it depends on what the science program is. So colleges really, the top colleges are really, most of the students I work with, sometimes they'll ask me, listen, Dan, should I sign up for this summer research program at Boston University? And I tell them, not if you want to get into the college that you want to go to, because a lot of times they're shooting for very selective colleges. And for the most part, colleges don't respect extracurricular activities where you can simply write a check to a university and sign up for a program. That's not what they're looking for. They are really looking for students who take initiative, and what that means is students who reach out to professors independently and set up their own research opportunities. And the other thing they're looking for is results. They want students who get published and who win the Siemens competition or the Intel competition. And in most cases, if a student is part of a organized summer research program where it's more like a 4 or 5 week summer camp, they're not going to get published, and secondly, it doesn't look impressive because anyone can sign up for it. Now there are exceptions to that rule. One exception would be obviously the RSI program at MIT, which is incredibly prestigious, but that's a very difficult program to get into. But for the most part, the majority of students we work with, we recommend that they set up their own research opportunities, and we actually have them reach out to professors and set up the interviews. Okay. We have time for maybe one more question, if anyone has a question. Okay, so the question here is, if my extracurricular activities are not very strong, would you recommend taking a gap year? So we've also worked with a lot of students who've taken a gap year, and in some instances, students take gap years, unfortunately, because they didn't know what they were doing when they applied, and so they got rejected everywhere. And so in cases where your extracurricular activities are not as strong, I would really have to look at your extracurricular activities and tell you whether you have a shot or not at the schools that you want to go to. My answer to that is 1 year of extracurricular activities will not necessarily make up for doing nothing for 4 years, but in certain cases, you can do an incredible amount in a year. So most students who work with us who come for a gap year, we completely revamp their extracurricular profile so that when they do reapply, they're completely different students and they look 180 degrees different from what they looked like the last time when they applied. The caveat to that rule is when you reapply to a school after you're getting rejected, oftentimes they will keep your file on hand, so they will pull your old application, and so that becomes incredibly problematic if it's a school that you've already been rejected to. So the majority of students we work with who reapply after a gap year end up only applying to the schools that they hadn't applied to as seniors. We got one more question here. In my essay, is it okay to expand on one of my main extracurriculars in my resume? The answer to that is no. If that's if your essay is simply talking about your extracurricular activity and what you did in it, it's not okay because they don't like that. And number two, it's a personal statement. It's a personal statement that's meant to shed light on who you are as a person and not simply what you do in one activity. So you can include your extracurricular activity in your personal statement, but it can't be solely about that, if that makes sense. Okay, so that's it for all the questions. Thanks so much for coming, and please feel free to reach out to us either by email or by phone if you have any further questions. All right, thank you. Can you mute it?